Okay, so I'm going to hopefully just start with the learning sponsors. Right? And then we'll go from there, all right? Okay, was Evan show this morning?
No, I didn't see him in shul this morning.
Oh, okay.
Did not see him.
And what about Erwin? I assume he was.
Erwin was. Erwin has your side today.
Oh, okay. All right.
Father.
So our learning sponsors, A Year of Learning by Sue and Arnie Gorelick, in memory of Malka Pearl Mann and Philip Mann, and Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, and Beryl ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Yosef ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, and Rivka Perel Rosner Bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, and in memory of family members murdered in the Holocaust, Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Cheryl Scher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marsha Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Uriel Paul Federbush, Uriel Pinchas ben Harav Shimon, Sharon and Fred Lisker, their family and many friends, in memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman, Edelbat Yaakov, Leslie and Gail Kaplan, in memory of their parents, Harry and Marjorie Siddell and Irving and Pearl Kaplan, friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, and Martha Gitler, Charna Bas Yeshaya, friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova Bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka Bat Yosef, friends of Joe Wolf, Yosef ben Chaim, many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, A Month of Learning by Stanley Presser, in memory of his wife, Chayalea Bat Zev HaKohen, by Mendel and David Cheslow, in memory of her mother, Shosha Bat Ber Leib, Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her mother, Yita Bat Nachman Binyamin. Week of Learning by Aviva Hochsander Sulzberger and Vern Sulzberger, in memory of her late husband, Ephraim ben Yitzchak Aryeh, and her mother, Malka Bat Yischar, Marcia and Gary Schrager, in memory of her father, Shmuel ben Meir, and Lenny Bahar, in memory of her husband, Yitzchak ben Menachem. Also, today is the, 23rd, right? So we don't have any days of learning today. And so we'll say, Shama Heaven Aliyah, Krenk Rafia, Velti Yeshir Shama Tliya, and the Chol B'nai Yisrael, Good Ben Shia. Okay. Okay, Harvey's on, Steve, Zev, and Bob. Okay. Hopefully Erwin will be getting on and join us shortly. I'd like to suggest that we start, okay, assuming that everyone was able to do some Gemara over Shabbos. Okay, if we go to Mem Aleph Amud Beis, 3 lines up from the bottom. Okay. Ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, that would be a reasonable point to start. Okay. So the Gemara then tells us in this discussion, okay, about the weights for the various items, okay, and let's call it the thread for the moment, or the strip of crimson that was tied around the certain animals. When Rav Dimi came, Ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan, When Rav Dimi came to Eretz Yisrael, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Shalosh Lishonot Shamati. He said, I learned about the fact that there were three teachings. Okay, Echad Shel Para, one regarding the Para Aduma, the red heifer, the Echad Shel Sa'ir HaMishtaleach, one about the scapegoat, the Echad Shel Mitzorah, and one also about the Mitzorah. Okay, this was the fact that the Mitzorah for its purification would need to take birds, two birds, remember, one was a chatas, one was an ola, and in that purification process, he also would need cedar wood and a strip of crimson and hyssop, okay? So that would be the third example. Right. So Rav Dimi then continued, Achat mishkal asara zuz, one was the weight of 10 zuz, the achat mishkal shnei slaim, and one was the weight of 2 slaim, okay, which is 2 selah, which is basically equal to 8 zuz, the achat mishkal shekel, and one was the weight of a shekel, which was equal to 2 zuz. The aim li lefaresh, but I cannot explain which is which. Okay? And it's understandable because remember the different measures changed biblically, rabbinically, but they also, even in rabbinic times, they varied from location to location. So for example, the weights in Galilee were different than the weights in Yerushalayim. Okay? So, ki ata Ravin, Persha Mishmei the Rabbi Yonatan. When Ravin came to Eretz Yisrael from Babylonia, he explained it in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, clarifying the weights of the crimson, of the strips. Shel Paraz, we start 42 Amud Aleph, right? Regarding the red heifer, okay? That particular example, okay? What did it weigh? Mishkal Asara Zuz. He claimed it weighed 10 Zuz. Mishal Sa'ir HaMishtaleach. And as regarding the scapegoat, Mishkal Shnei Slaim, that its weight was 2 selah. Okay? And then Ba'al Mitzorah, Mishkal Shekel. The weight of the crimson utilized as part of the purification for the Mitzorah was 2 zuz. Now, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is citing, Pligi ba Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Rabbanan Bapara, that there was an argument between Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta and the rabbis regarding the weight of the crimson strip regarding the red heifer. Chad amar mishkal asara, Chad amar mishkal shekel. One said the weight was 10, in other words, 10 zuz. The other said it was 1 shekel, right? Which we've already said is only 2 zuz. Okay. And what happened? B'simanich, and the way to remember it, okay, echad hamarbeh, ve'echad hamam'it. One who said it was more, one who said it was less. Now, Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah midiftei, the Ravina. And so we have another discussion. He says, Lo b'para pligi, that argument that Rabbi Yochanan said between Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta and the rabbis was not in regard to the red heifer, ela b'sa'ir hamishtaliach pligi, but rather they were arguing about the scapegoat. Vahahu yoma nach nafshe deravya bar kisi, and that same day he said that Rav Ya bar Kisi happened to pass away, they used his passing as a way of remembering who said what in regards to the weight, namely, excuse me, he said, Va'anachnu ba simana ravya kisi mechaper kesayir hamishtaleh. That Ravya ben Kisi atones like the scapegoat. In other words, the death of a righteous person, okay, brings atonement for that generation. Now, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, says Rabbi Yitzchak, Shtei shtichot shamati. He said, I heard about two slaughters, since the other said about different weights, I heard about different slaughterings. He said, Echad shel para, one in regards to the red heifer, the Echad shel paro, and one in regards to the bull of the high priest. Echad kshera bazar, the Echad psula bazar. One is acceptable or suitable, valid, when it's accomplished by a non-Kohen. The other is invalid when done by a non-Kohen. V'lo yadana ha'minayu. And I don't know which of them is which. So the Gemara picks up and tells us, Itmar. On this it was said as follows, Shchitat para uparo Rav u'Shmuel, that on the slaughter of the red heifer and the Kohen Gadol's bull, there was a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. Chad amar para psula. One said in regards to the non-Kohen slaughter of the red heifer, it's invalid. Paro kshera. But in the high priest's, the Kohen Gadol's bull, okay, it was accepted. Chad amar, and one said, paro psula. In regard to the high priest's bull, it's invalid, para kshera. And in regard to the red heifer, it is valid. Furthermore, the Gemara then picked up and told us, Tistayin, you might conclude then the following. The Rav who, the Amar para psula, that it's Rav who said that with regards to the red heifer, it's invalid. The Amar Rabbi Zera, because it was Rabbi Zera who cited the following, Shchitat para bezar psula, that the slaughter of the red heifer by a non-Kohen is invalid. Va'amar Rav Allah, and Rav said about this, Elazar v'chuka shaninu ba. Namely, he said that we cited the pasuk that connected it with Elazar and that fact that it had to be a statute, namely that according to Rav, it may appear to be said, okay, that so long as the that it was had to be slaughtered in front of Eliezer or Elazar, okay, for it to be valid. And if it was not the case, then it was clearly invalid. Okay, so that would mean that if it was done, okay, according to Rav, not by Elazar, but by a non-Kohen, it would be invalid. V'Rav, ma'ishna para. And so Rav, what was so different or unique about the red heifer? Dechtiv Elazar v'chuka, because it specifically refers to Elazar and chuka, statute, implying that was how it had to be done always. Paronami, but maybe we might use the same argument conceptually to say in regards to the high priests, the Kohen Gadol's bull, here too, Haktiv Aharon v'chuka. There too, we have it written specifically regarding Aaron and a statute. So the implication being, why could the Gemara asking, why couldn't we use the same linguistic model as a challenge to Rav? right? Shchita lav avodahi. But the Gemara goes on and answers is the shchita may not necessarily be part of the avoda. Ihachi, if that's the case, paranami, okay, then maybe we should say the same thing should apply to the red heifer as well. Shane para the kadshe bedekabayati, that namely that the slaughter of the red heifer has nothing to do really with avoda, okay, but it's not even kadshe kadoshim. It's simply a fact that it is part of the kadshe bedekabayat, the temple maintenance items. That's the point. So the Gemara then says, Vilav kol dechenu. Okay, and here we're going to say that the phrase kol dechen is like kal v'chomer. Okay, so can't we say here that we might make a kind of kal v'chomer argument? Amar Rav Shishi or Shisha b'rei de Rav Idi, says Rav Shisha in the name of Rav Idi, the following. Midei dahava amar ot negaim. Since we can say that the halacha has a situation that it describes regarding the appearance of leprosy, let's call it leprosy, negaim, okay, on a house, on a person, on a garment, delav avodahi, and despite the fact that it is not considered sacred worship, ubaya kahuna, it nevertheless requires a kohen. Therefore, we have an example where something that is not part of sacred worship, avoda, still requires the role of a kohen. Why couldn't I say here, therefore, that the shchita of the animal, even if you claim that it's not avoda, nevertheless has to be done by a kohen? Okay, so that's the issue regarding Rav's view. Now let's jump and examine Shmuel's view. Uvila Shmuel, the Amar Paro Psula, who basically said that according to him, right, that if the high priest, the Kohen Gadol's ox, was slaughtered by a non-Kohen, it was invalid. Maishna Paro. What difference are we talking about in regards to his bull? Dichtiv Aharon v'chuka. Because we've already said that linguistically, since it says Aharon and chuka, Aharon and a statute, I could have used the same reasoning that we saw with Rav, right, and say, therefore it had to be done by a Kohen. Para nami hakativ elazar v'chuka. And also you're saying, we use that example to say with para, with the red heifer, since it's written Elazar and Chuka in statute. Shani hata. But I might say it's different in that case of the para aduma. Why? There's chti, because it's written b'shachat ota lefanav. Namely, that the pasuk says that he shall slaughter it before him. Namely, sheyehe zar shochet ve'elazar ro'eh. Namely, that it might imply that a non-Kohen could slaughter the animal under the supervision, I'll put it that way, or the watchful eye of Elazar. Now, what happens? Rav and Shmuel still have this machloket. The Rav would respond as follows: Shelo yasich da'ato mimenu, that I understand the part of the pasuk that namely says that he shall slaughter it before him, so that we don't have any hesech hadat, any lack of, let's call it attention, or diversion of attention. Ushmoil, shelo yasich da'ato minale. And how then does Shmuel claim the same perspective, that there cannot be any hesech hadat, any diversion of attention? Nafkale mi v'saraf et hapara le'einav. He derives it from a different pasuk that says specifically, and he shall burn the heifer in his sight. Okay? So coming back then, if that's the case, taking that verse, v'saraf et hapara le'einav, how does Rav deal with it? Rav chad b'shchita v'chad b'sreifa. Rav would argue, he learns from this that you have two requirements, namely one regarding the Kohen who has to do the slaughtering, and one regarding another Kohen who has to do the burning. Utsricha. And he says, then that's necessary. Why, says the Gemara? De'i katav rachmana b'shchita. Because if the text, okay, had only been written, if the Torah written by Hashem had only been written, okay, regarding simply the issue of slaughter, mishum detchilat avodei, because we could argue that that's part of the first step in the avoda process, in the sacred worship process. Aval sreifa emalo. I might say maybe the burning is not. Okay, shricha. Therefore, the pasuk comes to tell me I do need to have a kohen involved in the shchita, but also in the sreifa. Ve'i katav rachmana b'sreifa, and were the Holy One only to have written, and I put in the word only, to have written the requirement of kohen participation with the burning, mishum dahashta hu demit kashra para. Why? Because here, this is what makes the animal actually ready for the whole ritual process, right? Aval shchita aim alone. But I would say perhaps simply slaughtering it has nothing to do with that tzricha. Therefore, here too, I need to have it said. So that's why I, as Rav, could argue I need one for each. Okay. So the Gemara asks, fine, if that's Rav's reasoning, that he could learn two different items from each of those psukim, lema'ute mai, to exclude what? Ilema lema'ute asefat afra umilui mayim lekidush. It comes to tell us, it says, that it comes to exclude the requirements of who it can be to gather the ash, and who is it that fills the water for the sanctification. And sanctification here is a code word for the act of using the mayim tahorim, the holy water, the sacred, the pure water, for purification. So I would say keep that in mind, that as we continue with the Gemara, we're going to see what I'm calling these code words, okay, to help us keep in mind what Chazal is talking about. Okay, in other words, that is the pouring of the water, mixing it with the ash, using them together for the purpose of tahara. Now we're on to Mem Bet Amud Beis. Okay, so why are we saying all this? Why do we say that to exclude certain people from parts of the red heifer ceremony, I'm going to say. Okay? So as we continue in a moment on Amud Beis, keep in mind the following, that there were a number of steps, okay? And each step has its own, let's say, details, parameters. And the question we might ask is that, do the parameters of one step apply to the next step or not? Okay. So who are we excluding here? Okay. Right now, we're saying that there needs to be a Kohen for the shechita, and for the slaughter, and a Kohen for the burning. Okay. But that may exclude the need for a Kohen to gather the ashes and to mix them with the water. Let's go on. We now continue with another section of the same segment dealing with the para aduma in the Torah. Lamishmeret lamei nida k'tiv. And it shall be kept for the congregation, okay? In other words, for the Jewish people, as water for sprinkling, right? Ele lema'ute hashlachat eitz erez ve'ezov ushni tolat delav gufa de paraninu. Maybe, he says, it comes to exclude something else, namely the throwing in of the wood, of the hyssop, okay, and of the crimson, right, strip, okay, which we're saying maybe that's not part directly of the para aduma process. Maybe the process only deals with what to do about the animal and not to do with what we'll call for the moment secondary steps in the entire purification process. Okay. So the Gemara continues. Itmar. But about this we have the following said. Okay. Shchitat para bazar. That the slaughter of the red heifer can be done by a non-Kohen. Rabbi Ami Amar. Rabbi Ami says, Kshera, but that is valid. But Rabbi Yitzchak Nefacha Amar Psula. And Rabbi Yitzchak Nefacha disagrees, saying it is invalid. Ula Amar Kshera. Ula says it is valid. Va'amrela, and others say Psula, that it is invalid. Now, Meitiv Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, L'siyuei l'Rav. Now we come, interestingly enough, to a challenge by Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, which is really going to be a, let's call it a challenge directed at Shmuel's approach, okay, and instead in support of Rav's approach. Okay. Namely, he says as follows: Ein li ela hazaat meimeha she'en ksherim be'isha kebeish. He says, I have only have the derivative. I learned, okay, that where is it invalid? When it is sprinkled by a woman as opposed to by a man. Okay? But ain ksherim ela bayom. And also that it was only to be considered valid if it's done by daytime. So the Gemara asks, Minayim lerabot shchitata, v'kabalat dama, v'hazaat dama, usreifata, v'hashlachat eitz erez ve'ezo ushni tolad. How do we know then that these other stages, these other steps, okay, namely the slaughter and receiving of the blood and the sprinkling of its blood and the burning of the animal and the throwing in then to this fire of, right, of certain kinds of wood, cedar wood, and of hyssop, and of the strings of crimson. What about these? Talmud Lomar, Torah. The text says that this is a Torah, which we're going to translate here as not necessarily an instruction, but a clear, resolute requirement, almost a statute. Yachol she'ani marbe af asefat afara umiluim mayim v'kiddush. If that's the case, says the Gemara, I might also include among all of these stages of the para aduma purification process, the collection of the ash and its mixing in with the water, and then the actual act of sanctification, of purification. Talmud Lomar, however, our text tells us, Zot, this, namely, Yechol she'ani marbe af asefat apara, efra, u'milui mayim v'kiddush, Toma, Talmud Lomar, Zot. Again, in both cases, I thought to include additional items, but instead, okay, the collection of ash and the filling, mixing in of the water, things like that, may be limited because these other things are incorporated in a pasuk that tells me this, which is limiting, defining it to this specific statutes. Therefore, the verse says, this is the statute. Talmud Loma Zot. Okay. What happens now? Gemara Ita, asks the Gemara. The Rabot et Elu, Ulahotzi et Elu. So what made you think, says the Gemara, the jest upon using the word Torah as a statute, as a law, okay, that we include certain specific stages and exclude other specific acts or stages? Achar sheribeh hakatuv umi'et. Amarta. Okay? Namely, after the verses have done what? They've seemed to include certain things and exclude others. Hare anu lameidim, maybe we need to learn instead, kulan mehazaat memeha, regarding the sprinkling of the water. Ma hazaat memeha, okay, einan ksherim be'isha kebe'ish. Maybe that's the issue. Maybe that specific stage, okay, the sprinkling of its water. Maybe that's not valid when done by a woman as opposed to a man. Ve'en ksherin ela bayom. And it's not valid unless it's done during daytime. Af ani avi shchitata v'kabalat dama v'hazaat dama usreifata v'hashlachat eitz erez ve'ezo ushni tolat. So likewise, says the Gemara, we include in those stages that are part of the para's purification process that clearly has to be done appropriately by a Kohen, right? its slaughter, the reception of its blood, the sprinkling of its blood, we said the slaughter, I'm sorry, and the throwing in of the cedar wood, the hyssop, and its burning, as well as the strip of crimson. O'il ve'en ksherin be'isha kebe'ish, because we might argue, since these are not valid when done by a woman, as if done by a man, ein ksherin ela bayom. So likewise, other stages would not be valid unless done by day. Umotziani asefat afara efra umilui mayim v'kiddush, and I will exclude the gathering of the ashes and the mixing of the water and its actual sanctification, its application on the Tameh person. O'il uksherin be'isha kebe'ish, since these are valid if done by a woman as done by a man, ksherin nami bayom uvalayla, they're also then done and considered valid by night just as much as by day. Now, Bahai might yuvta. So now, having said this, the Gemara says, what proof might we have? Right? Okay. And remember, this was all as a challenge to Shmuel's view that the para could be done by a zar as opposed to by a Kohen, namely as follows. Sorry. Ilema psulin be'isha psulin nami bazar. If I'm going to say that the same way it's invalid when a woman does it, it's invalid by a non-Kohen. Haza'at me'mehat tochia. The sprinkling of the water is proof. Shepsulin be'isha uksherin bazar. Namely, that is invalid if done by a woman, but it is valid when done by a non-Kohen. Right? Okay. In other words, the persons that are invalid for the sprinkling might be a woman, might be an androgynous, okay, a tumtum, shotet, things like that. Chere shotet, and maybe a katan. Okay, so let's go on. Now, Amar Abai. Hold on, I'm saying Abai is challenging. Hainu tiyuvte. Okay? We could say that this is a response. This is a challenge. Isha ma'itama. The reason that a woman is precluded. Why? Elazar velo isha. Because the pasuk said specifically Elazar and not a woman. Zar nami. Elazar velo zar. So I could use the same argument and say, since it says Elazar, that tells me it's got to be a Kohen, and therefore Shchita by a zar, by a non-Kohen, is not viable. Amar Ula. However, Ula comes back and says, Kol haparasha kula. This entire section of the para aduma, right? Mashma, okay? It seems to give the impression, motzi miyad mashma, okay? That on one hand, it derives certain things, okay, applicable to that yad, to that, I'm going to call it stage. That's what it tells us. Umashma memela. And it's applicable to something else at a different point, at a different stage. In other words, the laws applying to one situation don't necessarily apply to another. Okay? So at this point, what happens? We would naturally ask the question about Ula's explanation. How can Ula say that you would have laws applying to one part, one stage of the para aduma process, and those same laws shouldn't carry?
Yes, somebody told me? Okay.
Okay. So the pasuk now we look at is going to try to deal with Ula's explanation and Ula's statement. Right? Unatatem ota el Elazar hakohen, and you shall give it, okay, to Elazar the Kohen. Right? And the implication of the rest of that verse is that he takes it outside the camp and he slaughters it there. Okay. Now, ota le'elazar, v'lo l'dorot le'elazar. That seemed to tell us that it, namely the para aduma, was what we were talking about. Okay, and only for him, but not necessarily for other generations. Ikadam, right? And there are those that therefore say the dorot, the Kohen Gadol. That maybe when it means for other generations, it implies other generations of Kohen Gadol. Okay. V'yikadam, right? The dorot b'Kohen Hidyat. And others say, no, it applies for further generations of a common Kohen, namely all the other stages. So the Gemara tries to respond and tell us, Bishlama lamanda amar l'dorot b'Kohen Hidyat, Shapir. If you're saying that this applies then to other common Kohanim, for other generations, fine. We can apply that the one pasuk and its parameters apply to others. Ela laman da'amar, the dorot b'Kohen Gadol. But according to the one who says it applies to Kohen Gadol, minale, on what basis could we derive this? Gamar chuka chuka miyom haKippurim. Maybe we'll use a gzera shava, a verbal analogy, okay, and say, since we have the word statute with regards to Kohen Gadol, we'll apply it here to also the situation of the para aduma, okay, and learn it that way. Okay? That namely, just as the whole Yom Kippur avoda is to be done ideally by the Kohen Gadol, that's what we will apply perhaps to the para aduma. But if we look at another verse, the next phrase, v'hotzi ota, right, and says he brings it out, shelo yotzi acheret ima, that he can't bring any other animal out with it. Kiditnan, as taught elsewhere in the Mishnah, lo haita para rotza latzeit, that if the red heifer itself did not want to leave outside the camp, ein motzein ima shchora, we won't bring another black one with it. Shelo yamru shchora shachatu, so that people won't say, well, maybe they slaughtered the black one instead of the red one. Furthermore, the ein motzein ima aduma. Not only that, but we don't bring out another red heifer, even if we were to have one. Shelo yamru shtayim shachatu, so they won't say that they slaughtered two of them. Rabbi Yama, And Rebbe then says, Lo min Hashem huzeh, ela mishum shenei amar, ota levada. No, he says, Rebbe, darshaning the pasuk, he tells us it's not for that reason, multiple animals, but because the pasuk says ota, it means it itself, it only it, by itself. Vitanakama, and as far as the earlier Tana, what did he say in regards to the use of darshaning the phrase ota, v'hotzi ota? Ha ktiv ota. It's still written it. Man Tanakama. Who then was this Tanakama? Rebbe Shimon he. It was Rebbe Shimon. The Darish Tame Dikra, who used to interpret all of the possible rationales for a pasuk. Namely, what's the rationale of this mitzvah here? Mai Beinaihu. So what's the difference then between them? Ika Beinaihu, as we go over a little bit on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, the Apek Chamur Bahada, that perhaps he would have taken out some other animal like a donkey, okay? And therefore the people would be concerned, oh, what animal did he slaughter? What animal got burnt? How is this really a valid purification process? Okay? So therefore we come back to the explanation, the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who says the word ota means it, by in it of itself. Okay? Now, let's go on just a little bit. Okay? On Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, we've got a couple minutes left. Furthermore, for the same pasuk. Okay? The shachat ota, when it says he shall slaughter it, namely, shalo yishchot acheret ima, that he does not slaughter another animal with it. Okay? Now, lefanav, before him, lefanav, before it, really, or before him, the Rav, according to Rav, we saw already, shalo yasich dato mimena, that he does not divert his attention from it, namely Elazar. The Shmuel, sheyehi zar shochet be'elazar ro'eh, as we saw earlier, that Shmuel said a non-Kohen can slaughter, but it has to be observed by Elazar. Okay? So what's going to happen, just a word or two ahead, and then we're going to finish. The Gemara is going to be continuing on Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph to again take further phrases from the whole section of the Para Aduma, okay, and darshan explain each pasuk. And why does it need to do that? Because I'm suggesting, we saw it earlier, suggested by Ula, that some psukim had certain parameters which did not apply to other psukim, and vice versa. And later psukim had parameters for that stage that didn't apply to earlier psukim. Okay, and that's what we see as we try to show the various explanations of the various psukim in the Para Aduma section. Okay, so that's going to continue really as we pick up tomorrow. The rest of the Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. Okay, and basically go into some more discussion, okay, as to some of the other aspects or stages of the purification process until we get really towards the end of Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, where we get a whole long new Mishnah. Okay,
What excites for me is the focus on the potential frailty of the Kohen Gadol and the potential for the Kohen Gadol being incapable physically of doing the slaughter. And that is another issue that doesn't seem to be touched on here.
it's not touched, it will be touched on, okay? Because just to give a quick example to answer your question, Steve, and it's a good point. Other Mishnayot, as we go on, a couple of pages ahead, will deal with other examples of the frailty, potential frailty of the Kohen Gadol. Since he fasts that day and is expected to carry out the entire avoda. So one example, since you raised it, I'll just give a very quick, brief example. He starts the slaughter of his bull, right? But he doesn't finish it. Another Kohen comes and finishes it because the Kohen Gadol is expected to collect the blood. So how can you expect him to do the whole entire slaughtering of the bull and then still be able to do the blood and collect the blood and do so in such a way so that during the whole time he can stir the container of blood so it doesn't congeal. So we will get to examples as we continue some more in the Mishnah and Gemara as to situations where the concern for the frailty, potential frailty of the Kohen Gadol is brought up. Okay? So I hope that at least partially answers your question. Okay? That was a good comment. Okay? Anybody else? All right, guys, take care and stay well. All right?
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You
What,